Hi everybody, it's Corbin, and today I'm here to talk to you some more about my project. So, welcome back to my Whim and Awkward Start. So, I'm talking today about the BootstrapFashion Make Your Own Stuffed Dressed Form. Now, I'm going to be talking to you about one particular aspect, which is the construction, the overall construction, which I have some video of it. I'll overlay it over this. But let's go ahead and talk about it. So, the first part of my construction that I had that was the longest part, that literally took me the most amount of man hours, was the fact I had to flatline and stitch down every ounce of my interfacing to my fabric, which, if you can avoid it, don't do it. It's not worth your time, it's not worth the investment. It also does not work for the pattern itself. When you hit certain points of the pattern, when you're working with a 3/8 seam allowance, it doesn't exactly lend itself nicely to the instructions if it's fraying and falling apart already. So that is something to bear in mind. Please, if you can find it, get the fusible one. It'll make your life so much easier. With mine, the biggest heartache of sewing it, besides sewing on the interfacing, was working with the center support. The way the center support, no problems constructing that by itself, no problem sewing in the little tube hole, none of that was an issue. My main problem was once I had to stitch it into the center, because it's such a small seam allowance for that center seam where you're attaching it to, and it was fraying, so I couldn't do it exactly how they called, so I had to sew both center seams shut and together so it would be reinforced enough to where I could stitch down the center support, if that makes any sense. So the center seams of the entire thing, front and back, I had to fuse together as one, which it doesn't call for, which means it's going to be slightly askew, my center support. But I don't care at this point. I just wanted it done. So that's a thing. I think my biggest dislike with this pattern so far as construction goes, the seam allowance is way too small. I understand why the 3/8 is there. I understand that it's more precise, it's more fiddly, there's less bulk inside the curves and the turns, and I get that. But I would rather have had a 5/8 and had to have trimmed everything down so there was less bulk and then notched it and then clipped it and done all of that than deal with such a small seam allowance. That being said, so the next time I do this pattern, I'm going to increase the seam allowance to 1/2 inch. Excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold. So I'm going to increase it to 1/2 inch if I sew this again. And I'll tell you, there were some hiccups with the BootstrapFashion pattern generation. I'm not going to get too much into that because it's a next video thing, but be very, very, very precise with your measurements. If you don't know exactly what you're doing, get someone else to help you, or follow the instructions on their website to a T. Granted, the website doesn't have words in their instructions, it's just images, so it can be a little misleading. But do your best, do your homework, figure it out. Otherwise, you'll end up with the same issue so far that I've noticed on my pattern. Now, the next thing is that I found really difficult or annoying was the way they had you notch the pattern for this. So, when I learned to sew and I took sewing classes, the way they taught us was never notch into your seam allowance. Because it's just going to weaken your seam allowance, it's going to, over time, cause issues with your garment. If you're going to notch into your fabric, notch away from your seam allowance. So, the way this one has you do it is it tells you to notch into the seam allowance, which is, okay, fine. It's not my favorite method, I'll say that. Most of the notches are on curved areas, so you're going to have to notch them and do what you have to do anyway in the seam allowance. But what I've observed, in particular with this pattern, is even though I notched exactly where I was supposed to, the fabric wasn't warped, nothing was warped, I saved notching after I had flatlined, so I made sure it was right, is that it literally didn't line up. It would be just askew by that much. Not even, I mean, like a centimeter maybe. Not even a centimeter. Maybe a millimeter. It wasn't matching up. Now, that could be my fault. That could also be a pattern generation fault. It could be a lot of issues. Excuse my cat. But it's just one of those things that's really annoying. So, in particular with sewing in the center seam, the center support, that is where I noticed it was really off in there. Um, so I sat there, I stitched it in exactly where it was supposed to be, and I lined up my notches, and then it was too long to fit inside of my dress form. So then I was like, well, okay, let's try it this way, which was lining up the tops where they'd meet and then stitching down, which was the only way I could get it to actually fit in the dress form. Otherwise, up in the neck, I ended up with like that much of my center support when I was lining up with the notches. Now, I'm sure that's a pattern drafting issue with the software. I don't know why that happened. I can't explain it to you. With the way of me having to sew it from the top of the neck down first to make sure it lined up, I ended up with it exactly at the bottom of the dress form, and that's not me cutting it out wrong. And I don't think the fabric warped at all, because there's very little stretch on the way it's cut. It's just what I am seeing with it as an issue, as a major issue, is that I think the pattern drafting software has a little bit of a hiccup with making sure those exactly line up. I don't know if maybe it's the fact that it's a plus size pattern or what, but that was a major issue as far as construction goes. Now, otherwise, the instructions, very great. I'm happy I printed them out. They literally, let me pull this random piece of paper out. They literally give you pictures, step by steps of every single thing you're doing. You never have to really guess, because if you're curious what's happening, you can just look in the book and it has a picture. If you're curious about that, there's a video that's sped up and it's just kind of like a sample. This is how your thing will look. But if you pause it and you freeze frame it and you slow it down, which you can do all with YouTube, it shows you exactly what they're doing, how they do it. They don't exactly show you them notching it. They don't show you little things like that. But it's enough extra things in that it shows you. It's very straightforward. It's very simple. So a beginner could sew this without much problem. It's really not complicated. But those hiccups that I've listed are kind of what I'm like, it's a good thing that I've been sewing for 10 years. It's not like I'm new to this. So that's my problem that I see with this. That's the first hiccup I see. That is something I will tell you that I had issues with. Seam allowance, I found it far too small. I said that. So if you guys are going to sew this, I recommend putting in your own seam allowance. Don't check the box to have included seam allowance. It was way too small. If you're going to get seam allowance because you're like me, lazy, and didn't want to sit there with a ruler and making sure it was perfectly exactly how it was supposed to be, I understand, and I won't fault you for it. Do it. If you're going to use their seam allowance, realize it's very tiny. Literally, right at the edge of your presser foot, slightly over, is the seam allowance. If you're fine with that, good. Otherwise, yeah. So if you guys have done this before, let me know down in the comment section below. Give me a like, a favorite, subscribe, share this with a friend who likes fashion, and let me know how you think I'm going, actually, because I am curious. So I'll talk to you guys later.
Do you like what you see? Then...
subscribe!